Welcome to the WWE Podcast, the most passionate and authentic wrestling analysis on the web. We've got you covered with every Raw, SmackDown, and NXT show, giving you a no bullshit opinion. We know you love wrestling. We do too. So let's get this show underway.
And that's the bottom line. What? 'Cause Stone Cold said so.
Hey guys, what's going on? And welcome to another edition of WWE Rivalries on the WWE Podcast. It is October 30th as we are 2 days away from November. And this is a very special edition of WWE Rivalries because I won't be covering a rivalry this week. In fact, I will be covering the career of one Kurt Angle. And I've wanted to do this for a while because I don't think the career of Kurt Angle is talked about quite enough when it comes to WWE. And especially this week, seeing as though Matt already did a rivalries type of episode over on Wrestling Nostalgia, covering Randy Orton and The Undertaker, which was a fantastic episode, by the way. I really suggest you guys go check that out if you already haven't. I think this is a good opportunity to take an episode and focus on Kurt Angle and maybe stray away from rivalries for just this 1 week because you guys have already gotten a fix of rivalries for the week. So I am really excited to get into the career of Kurt Angle in WWE that strung on from late 1999 to mid-2006 until he eventually went to TNA Impact Wrestling and then eventually returned to WWE in the spring of 2017. But before we get into that, as always, I'd like to touch a bit onto the current product. So, more so than anything else, we are back into the SmackDown versus Raw season in light of the calendar flipping to November, or getting ready to flip to November, and Survivor Series being right around the corner. Now look, I don't mind the SmackDown versus Raw rivalry when it is built with a legitimate story. And that's what's lacking here. You know, a few weeks back, I did a rivalries episode on SmackDown versus Raw in the year 2005. And I talked about how much I liked that program because there was a story in place. For one, they had never done that type of angle before. And when they approached it, it wasn't merely because the calendar flipped to late October, early November, and everyone had brand loyalty. And it wasn't just following a draft. There had been rosters on SmackDown and Raw that had been in place in large part for the better part of 3 years. And even though there had been a draft earlier in 2005, it was only a change of 5 or 6 wrestlers. But now that they do drafts basically from scratch and they redraft the whole rosters, you get rosters that are almost half turned over from the year prior. And like, look, I don't mind what they did because it does shake things up. But at the same time, what's the point of a draft if you're just going to have the same matches but on the different brand? And that's where I'm kind of at right now because let's look at Monday Night Raw. We had AJ Styles versus Jeff Hardy. Well, they were feuding over the summer for the Intercontinental Championship over on SmackDown. You had Sheamus versus Matt Riddle. Well, they had some matches over on SmackDown before the draft, and I don't understand the point of doing drafts and switching up the rosters in the name of, you know, new matchups and fresh rivalries if you're going to have the same type of matches and the same type of programs, even though you made this big deal of doing the entry draft. Or not the entry draft, just the draft in general. And that's why I have a problem with them going back to the well each and every year to promote brand supremacy and basically taking over the Survivor Series pay-per-view. Because, like I said, this will be the 5th consecutive year that Survivor Series is essentially bragging rights, where it's just billed as Raw versus SmackDown, with the exception of last year when they threw NXT into the mix. And, you know, when they first did it in 2016, when they first restarted with the brand extension and Shane McMahon was in charge of SmackDown and Stephanie McMahon was in charge of Raw, I didn't mind it because they had gone back into the brand extension era. It had been the first time that they had separate brands and separate entities in quite so many years. So they wanted to drive home the fact that it was a new era in WWE and the brand extension was back in place. I didn't mind it. But since then, I have been getting kind of fatigued with it because there isn't a story in place. You know, we just closed out Hell in a Cell, all these different rivalries, and now everyone is supposed to just commit to their brands. And I'm not as harsh on the idea as, let's say, Matt is, and I'm sure as many of you guys are, but it has to have a story that makes sense. It can't just be that the calendar turned and now everyone is loyal to the brand. And for some of these guys, the brand that they've been on for just under a month. So look, I don't mind the idea, but in another part of me that doesn't like it is that you're taking over Survivor Series just to promote brand versus brand. There's no title matches. And that's something that I think is kind of a lost art because, look, one of the best 5-on-5 matches in recent memory was The Authority versus John Cena. And that was the coming out party, at least in my mind, for Dolph Ziggler. And when Sting debuted in WWE. But now you never have a chance for those type of matches anymore because it's always Raw versus SmackDown. Or, you know, think back to 2003. Team Austin versus Team Bischoff. In 2004, Team Angle versus Team Guerrero. You know, there's all these instances where you have teams facing off against each other, but they're building off of already existing programs and rivalries. But now we can't have that because it all has to be brand versus brand type of matches. And like I said, if you want to do it once in a while, like they did back in 2005, and just revisit it and actually have a story with congruity to it, more power to you. I'm here for it. I actually enjoy the brand versus brand type of programs, but only when the stories make sense. And this is, I think, the third consecutive year where I have just groaned at the idea that they are once again going back to the well with a Raw versus SmackDown Survivor Series approach. Now to give some thoughts on Hell in a Cell, very happy that Randy Orton won the WWE Championship. I thought it would have been a mega missed opportunity had they not put the belt back on him in the midst of his best run in, I would say, over 5 years for sure in WWE. I do hope that Drew gets the belt back before WrestleMania. I know there's some talks that Randy Orton may go into WrestleMania as WWE Champion and Edge may challenge him for that belt. I'm all here for Edge versus Randy Orton rematch, hopefully in front of fans in some capacity. But I don't want Orton to hold the championship. I don't want the WWE Championship to be defended against a part-time competitor. And I don't want to say Randy Orton is a legacy star just yet because he still is one of the best in the business and a full-time guy. But I just think that championship would be best served to be put back on Drew in a more meaningful program, and one that isn't so entrenched in personal disdain like it is with Edge and Randy Orton. I don't think that program needs the championship. I said it, I believe, last week or the week before. If it were up to me, it would be AJ Styles versus Drew McIntyre. But even aside from that, you could have Drew McIntyre against The Fiend, Drew McIntyre against Keith Lee. I just think there are so many different avenues that they could go down to face Drew McIntyre for the WWE Championship, as opposed to keeping the belt on Orton right up until WrestleMania to go head-to-head with Edge over it. But in the short term, really happy that Randy Orton has the WWE Championship. I'm interested to see what they do with The Fiend, but I don't know how they're going to get there and when they'll get there, considering that Randy Orton has a match scheduled against the Universal Champion Roman Reigns at Survivor Series. And that's a good segue, because to go over to the SmackDown side of things, the Roman Reigns versus Jey Uso match at Hell in a Cell, I liked it for the most part, but after a certain point, I felt like I was kind of watching a movie. And I like what WWE has done, especially in the Roman Reigns Jey Uso program, of kind of getting that audio around the ring that I don't know if, I guess the the ideas that we're not supposed to be hearing it, and that just the microphones around the ring are picking it up, and you hear kind of the dialogue going on. But I would say halfway through the match, it kind of got to be a bit too much. I understand what WWE was trying to do, and I respect the hell out of it, and I still give this program A+ as a whole. But I just felt as though they went a bit too far with trying to drive home the story that they were trying to tell. And again, I like the story. I think they've knocked it out of the park, but the match got a bit too slow for me. I felt like the last 15 minutes or so could have been condensed into under 10. I got kind of fatigued watching it, and once Jimmy came running in, and then Roman Reigns started crying, which kudos to him. The fact that he could practically sob on command like that is a real testament to what kind of actor he is. But it was drawn out a bit too long for my liking. I respected what they're trying to do. I'm still very content with the program as a whole, but I just feel like they went a bit too far. They exaggerated a bit too much with the whole dialogue and the storytelling and Roman Reigns crying. But aside from that, very good match, especially the first half. Really good moments. I thought it was brutal like it needed to be. And again, cementing Roman Reigns as a true top heel in the company. I'm anxious to see where they go with Roman Reigns beyond this, though. Obviously, there's the rumors running rampant that the returning Rock will be involved in some capacity, maybe at WrestleMania, to challenge him as to who is the true tribal chief of the family. But up until then, I think there's a lot of room for potential counterparts for Roman Reigns. Obviously, Matt has talked about it. I've brought up Kevin Owens is a very interesting guy. I think there's a lot left to be desired when it comes to how they're utilizing Kevin Owens right now. A former Universal Champion. I think he's over with the fans, although maybe a bit tough to tell as we're approaching, 8 months now in front of nobody in empty arenas. But I think Kevin Owens would be maybe a good stopgap for Roman Reigns between now and, let's say, Elimination Chamber time in February, if they are indeed going to build The Rock versus Roman Reigns to WrestleMania. But look, I think as a whole, as usual, I'm really enjoying SmackDown right now. And that's not to say I don't like Raw, because I do like the Hurt Business. I like Drew. I like Randy Orton. Now they have The Fiend over there. But I just really like the congruity of the SmackDown storyline. And I think it's very focused around Roman Reigns. I would like to see a bit more utilage out of Sami Zayn. I think that once again, since he's come back, they've kind of sheltered him. I'd like to see what they're going to do with Daniel Bryan calling out for maybe the Intercontinental Championship being used or defended every week. And speaking of Daniel Bryan, I heard that he came out and said this will be his last full-time run with the company. And that's all good. I understand that he has a family and, he's probably getting up there in age. He's been in WWE for about 10 years now. But if this is indeed his last full-time run with the company, it cannot be with a tag team with Kevin Owens. Because, look, I love Kevin Owens. I love Daniel Bryan. But these are two guys that can easily be used for bigger and better things, and especially Daniel Bryan. He has that pedigree that you could argue is rivaled by no one in WWE. And I just, when they had him come out with Kevin Owens, and then he was in the 8-man tag team match, I just can't help but let out a groan, because, there's just so many things that Daniel Bryan could be doing right now, especially if it is indeed his last full-time run with the company. And he's another prime candidate to go toe-to-toe with Roman Reigns if they need a stopgap for Reigns between now and WrestleMania season. I do hope the Roman Reigns and Jey Uso feud is done. I think they've squeezed all the possible juice from that program. But look, I think that Daniel Bryan, Kevin Owens, those are two prime guys that could be short-term counterparts and competitors for Roman Reigns and the Universal Championship picture. One other thing I want to touch on is Retribution. And I haven't really talked about it a lot because all of my feelings have been expressed by Matt over the last number of weeks. but I have to give my 2 cents in light of what happened at Hell in a Cell and on Raw. Retribution, the idea of Retribution, at its core, is a very good idea. I think that they had something when they first started with this angle of, blowing up, cars outside the building, vandalizing WWE headquarters, taking over the programming and whatnot. But it just quickly went sideways, and now it's almost as if it's past the point of no return. And I think the biggest thing for me that I don't understand is that the size of the group rather, has changed so many times that it makes it so unbelievable that it's such a powerful entity that the mass amount of followers just disappeared. Obviously, they have the main characters and Mace, Slapjack, Reckoning, T-Bar, and now the leader in Mustafa Ali. But if you remember, there were times when there was about 20 guys of Retribution who would come and take over the ring. But now those people are nowhere to be found, and the main event guys or the main guys of Retribution are losing each and every match. And it's too bad because in addition to the actual idea of Retribution being very, very good and intriguing at the beginning, now you have Mustafa Ali, who is doing his best work since joining the main roster in WWE, but it's all for nothing. And they're going up against another heel faction in the Hurt Business, who I love, by the way, and losing every single match. I just feel like this is going to quickly go by the wayside and quickly go the way of Raw Underground. And look, I'm not as negative towards it as maybe Matt is, because I still have some bit of hope withstanding in my body that they could turn it around and do something special with Retribution, because I do actually believe that the idea and the concept of the group has a lot of potential. But at the same time, like I previously mentioned, I still can't help but feel that they've passed the point of no return. And if that is the case, I just hope they put it to bed, we move on. And it's just very sad, because for a group that had so much potential, and a guy like Mustafa Ali has, at least in my mind, really come out of his shell since being revealed as the leader of this group, it's just very unfortunate that the creative, and I don't know if it's Vince McMahon has to do with it, but that everybody involved has done such a poor job in booking this group. But enough about the current product, and let's get into the reason why you guys are here, and that is for rivalries. But like I mentioned before, it is not a rivalries episode. It is an episode covering the career of Kurt Angle. Kurt Angle debuted in WWE in late 1999 at the Survivor Series pay-per-view, and this was right around about the time when, easy for me to say, right around about the time that I started watching wrestling. I was about 5.5 years old at the time, so yeah, I've been a fan for quite some time, as I'm 26 years old now. But he came in, and he was the first blue chip prospect that I had ever seen while watching WWE. And that, in saying that, I mean that, like, he was the first guy that came in and instantly got pushed to the main event. And what was crazy about him is that he was originally booked as a babyface. But if you watch his interview with Stone Cold Steve Austin on the Broken Skull sessions, he said that Vince McMahon quickly told him to turn heel in his first match. And isn't that crazy to think, given the fact that Vince McMahon is so reluctant to turn guys heels these days when he thinks they have a lot of potential? AKA Roman Reigns, John Cena, the list goes on and on. But they turned him heel, and I don't think WWE ever looked back, because you could argue that nobody had a better first year in the WWE than Kurt Angle, and that's including the likes of Triple H, John Cena, The Rock, Stone Cold Steve Austin. The first calendar year of Kurt Angle was nothing short of remarkable. And he quickly won the Intercontinental Championship, the European Championship. He had a WrestleMania triple threat match at WrestleMania 16, aka WrestleMania 2000, with Chris Jericho and Chris Benoit, which was an incredible match. I would really suggest you guys go watch that because it was a very cool, I would say, stipulation in the fact that the first fall was for the Intercontinental Championship and the second fall was for the European Championship. Benoit actually won the first fall and Chris Jericho won the second fall. So Angle walked out without either championship, but he didn't take a single fall in the match. Benoit pinned Jericho and vice versa. So even though they made him lose both championships at WrestleMania 16, they protected him. They continue on in 2000, and eventually he gets enticed into a program with Triple H where he becomes infatuated with Stephanie McMahon. And that was when they really started pushing Kurt Angle into the main event, is when they started making him tango with Triple H and the whole program of him being into Stephanie McMahon. There was an episode where he actually kissed Stephanie McMahon. He talked about that, about how he had to do it in front of Vince McMahon, and Stephanie actually called him a bad kisser after the scene was filmed. And the first time I remember Kurt Angle really being in a main event was SummerSlam 2000, as he main evented the pay-per-view with The Rock and Triple H for the WWF Championship. The Rock ended up retaining that championship, but that was a match where I thought to myself, like, okay, they have something special with this guy. And you gotta remember, the year 2000 was the year when Stone Cold Steve Austin was not around for the majority of it. So the door was really wide open at the top of the roster in WWE. Now, for the most part, when you think of the year 2000, it was the year of The Rock. It's the year that The Rock really took over and became the face of the WWF. You know, he won the Royal Rumble, he main evented WrestleMania, he won the WWF Championship at, I believe it was King of the Ring in May of 2000. He held it for 6 months after that. So it was really much the year of The Rock, and a lot of that tangoing with Triple H as he was the top heel at the time. But in that mix, you had guys like Kurt Angle and The Undertaker, and Rikishi slowly started to get a main event push as well when they turned him heel. But Kurt Angle really benefited from that opening at the top of the roster, because while The Rock was the guy as kind of the placeholder for Stone Cold Steve Austin in his absence, you still had an opening of guys being able to be The Rock's heel counterpart. And while, like I said, a lot of that was Triple H in the year 2000, Kurt Angle quickly unseated Triple H around the late summer and fall of 2000. And you saw that as he challenged The Rock at No Mercy 2000 and won the WWF Championship. And this was crazy, because who would have thought that a guy who was still less than a year into his run in WWF would unseat arguably the hottest babyface the company had seen since Stone Cold Steve Austin. And you could argue that The Rock was burning just as hot as Stone Cold Steve Austin, because, like I said, the year 2000 was the year of The Rock. So the fact that they had the trust and they had the confidence in Kurt Angle to defeat The Rock for the WWF Championship really showed what kind of promise and potential Kurt Angle had as a main event guy. He held the championship to No Way Out 2001, which was in February, which is now the time when Elimination Chamber is, as kind of the buffer between Royal Rumble and WrestleMania season. But along the way, he beat guys like The Rock again. He retained the WWF Championship in a Armageddon Hell in a Cell, which Matt covered on Wrestling Nostalgia last week. And he had a very memorable run as the WWF champion. And I gotta say that it really cemented Kurt Angle as a main event player just a year into his career. The year 2000, though, was really the coming out party for Kurt Angle, because that's when you had the Invasion angle take place. And much like in 2000, when Stone Cold Steve Austin wasn't around for a large chunk of it, in 2001, The Rock went away to start his movie career, and I believe he filmed The Scorpion King from WrestleMania to just about SummerSlam. So when they started the Invasion angle, there was still an opportunity and a vacant position left at the top of the WWF roster, because in addition to The Rock being away, you had Triple H on the shelf until January 2002 after he had a knee injury, and I believe it was May. So you had Triple H on the shelf, you had The Rock away in Hollywood, and those were two of the three biggest names in the company. So aside from Stone Cold Steve Austin, all of the main event guys were away. You could make the case that The Undertaker was still around, but at this time he was kind of in a tag team with Kane. So alongside Stone Cold Steve Austin, there was two vacant positions as main event guys that left the door open for Kurt Angle and, to a lesser extent, Chris Jericho to really fill those vacant spots. So then you had Kurt Angle get involved in a program with Stone Cold Steve Austin after Stone Cold Steve Austin turned heel and joined the Alliance. He won the WWF Championship over him for a short run in the fall of 2001. He was on Team Alliance at the Survivor Series, ended up turning on the Alliance, helping the WWF get the win. And then was involved in the 4-man tournament at Vengeance 2001 for the Undisputed Championship, which Chris Jericho eventually won. But following the event in the Invasion angle, Kurt Angle kind of took a backseat. And this was one thing about the first 2.5 years of Kurt Angle that I felt that he really kind of got a raw deal, is that although he was in meaningful programs throughout the year and he had cemented himself as a legitimate main event guy, whenever WrestleMania rolled around, he didn't get a very meaningful match. You know, the first one at WrestleMania 16, he was in the triple threat match with Benoit and Jericho, which I previously talked about. And while it was a very good match, it wasn't one that had a lot of meaning and a big build behind it. At WrestleMania 17, after just losing the WWF Championship a month prior, he was in a match with Chris Benoit, which, again, a very good match, but not a whole lot at stake, and an often forgotten match on an otherwise brilliant WrestleMania 17 card. WrestleMania 18 rolls around. You have 2001, which was the breakout year of Kurt Angle, where he legitimized himself on the level of guys like The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin, Triple H, had another run as WWF champion, was involved in the 4-man tournament to determine the undisputed champion at Vengeance 2001, and he gets put into a match with Kane. And I never really understood this, and WrestleMania 18 as a whole was a card that didn't make a whole lot of sense for a lot of ways. And I know it often just gets remembered for the iconic Rock vs. Hogan match, which it was. And you could argue that there was no bigger hype for a match than the Rock vs. Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 18. But aside from that match, it really was an underwhelming card, and not for a lack of talent or a lack of, very good wrestlers at the disposal of WWE and Vince McMahon at the time, but just very bad booking decisions, weird matches they went ahead with, like The Undertaker versus Ric Flair in a Street Fighter No Holds Barred match when The Undertaker was a heel. Again, it was a good enough match, but just for me, a program that didn't make a whole lot of sense. Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Scott Hall in probably the most forgettable Stone Cold Steve Austin WrestleMania match in the history of his career. Just wasting probably the last prime year of Stone Cold Steve Austin and the last prime WrestleMania he had in him. A main event of Triple H versus Chris Jericho for the Undisputed Championship. Again, a good enough match, but completely overshadowed by The Rock versus Hulk Hogan, and again, an otherwise forgettable main event in WrestleMania history. And then you had Kurt Angle versus Kane, and if I recall correctly, the whole story behind this match and the build was that he was going to submit Kane, and Kane had never tapped out, and he was going to make him tap with the ankle lock, and he ends up getting the victory over Kane. But again, it was just such a forgettable program and a forgettable match. And Matt has said this so many times. When the story is forgettable and you don't really care about it, it really doesn't matter how good the match is. And this was an instance where that was so true. And you could have had such better matches, or you could have done so many better things than Kurt Angle versus Kane. You could have had Kurt Angle versus Stone Cold Steve Austin. You could have had Kurt Angle go in as WWF champion and face Triple H in the main event. I still think that the main event of that card should have been Triple H versus Stone Cold Steve Austin, because those two never had a one-on-one match at WrestleMania. And I thought the stage was completely set for Austin to go toe-to-toe with Triple H, seeing as how The Rock was locked horns with Hulk Hogan at the time. You could have had Kurt Angle go up against The Undertaker. That would have been a cool match, and another guy that Undertaker could have taken down to add to the streak. I think it would have been a much better opponent than Ric Flair was to him. You could have had Kurt Angle versus Chris Jericho. Those two were the two breakout stars of 2001. So at WrestleMania in 2002, it would have made a lot of sense for those two to go up against each other. But all in all, a very forgettable, well, aside from The Rock versus Hulk Hogan, a very forgettable card, at least in my mind, at WrestleMania 18, and Kurt Angle was right in the thick of that, going up against Kane. But it was after WrestleMania 18, and pretty much as soon as Kurt Angle went bald, that he really hit his stride in WWE and became one of the true faces and workhorses of WWE. And that was after The Rock left for Hollywood and Stone Cold Steve Austin had to retire and walked away from WWE. And eventually The Rock came back in early 2003, and Stone Cold Steve Austin came back in early 2003 as well. And they both had one last final run leading up to WrestleMania 19, and both completely stepped aside as full-time competitors in the spring of 2003. But in the summer of 2002, and leading into 2003, is when Kurt Angle took the opportunity and filled the voids left by The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin, and really never looked back. And he main evented Vengeance 2002 in a triple threat match with The Undertaker and The Rock, one that The Rock eventually won, and won his last WWE Championship up until 2013 when he beat CM Punk. And that's a very underrated match that I would suggest you guys go watch, the triple threat match between Angle, Undertaker, and Rock in the summer of 2002. But when he performed in that match, and he went toe-to-toe with those two guys, and then following SummerSlam 2002, The Rock moved on, Kurt Angle really became, in my mind, one of the faces of the SmackDown brand. And after Brock Lesnar defeated The Rock for the WWE Undisputed Championship at SummerSlam 2002 and became an exclusive member to the SmackDown brand, Kurt Angle essentially became his heel counterpart and his main rival for the succeeding year, I would say. Kurt Angle took on the top heel role as Brock Lesnar turned babyface, which never really quite sat right with me. And they ended up main eventing WrestleMania 19, which was really cool to see because, like I talked about just before, is that Kurt Angle never really had a meaningful WrestleMania match. And the first one he gets into, he main events the show. And I gotta say, this one too kind of gets overshadowed because the match that went on right before it was The Rock versus Stone Cold Steve Austin, the last ever match in Stone Cold's career, the third match to complete the hat trick of matches that these two had, two of the biggest stars WWE has ever seen. So following up The Rock versus Stone Cold Steve Austin wasn't an easy task for Kurt Angle and Brock Lesnar. But they really knocked it out of the park, aside from the fact that Brock Lesnar almost ended his own career with a botched shooting star press. Brock Lesnar gets the victory over Kurt Angle, and Kurt Angle really puts over Brock Lesnar and cements him as, at least at that time, the new face of WWE. But their rivalry did not end there by any stretch, as they spent, I would say, all of 2003 really carrying SmackDown on their back with the help of The Undertaker. You always gotta give Undertaker credit for what he meant to SmackDown and WWE at this time. And I always say Undertaker was the workhorse of SmackDown and Triple H was the workhorse of Raw. But Kurt Angle and Brock Lesnar were the main event guys and really headlined SmackDown in the year 2003. But eventually they swapped as Brock Lesnar was the heel and Kurt Angle was the babyface. And look, I still believe that Kurt Angle was always a much better heel than he was a babyface. He had this intensity about him that was almost unmatched when he was at that like true heel moment. But locking up with Brock Lesnar, who is just the epitome of a heel, I think it was best served for Kurt Angle to play the babyface role in this circumstance. And they ended up going toe-to-toe at SummerSlam 2003 again. And with Kurt Angle as the babyface and the WWF Championship on the line, or at this point the WWE Championship on the line, this is what happened.
As Kurt Angle continues to lock in the ankle lock, he's going to snap the ankle. We got to get another referee out here or something. What the hell's going on here? But Brock Lesnar still has not tapped out. Lesnar still hasn't tapped out. The ankle lock's been locked in for 30 to 40 seconds. Yeah, and now he's tapping. Lesnar's tapping at the rest stand. We need there's no official out here. We need another referee in the back. We need somebody. Wait a minute. What? No! Mr. McMahon with a chair to the back of Kurt Angle. That deadly alliance strikes again. McMahon and Lesnar. The ball strikes again. Brock Lesnar tapped out to the ankle lock, but the referee was down and out. Mr. McMahon wants to have the championship around the waist of his man, Brock Lesnar. That would be total control for McMahon. Shot to the midsection. Brock's got him up cold. F5 on one leg. Look at Brock. He connects. God! He connects with the F5. Kurt right on his head. Kurt Angle may be out cold. Brock can barely stand on that leg after the ankle lock. Still connected with the F5. Here's the cover. Here's the hook of the leg. New champion. There's one. Right here in the damn it. Not this in. Kurt Angle kicked out. Shot. McMahon shot. Lesnar shot. Kurt Angle kicked out of the F5. Brock Lesnar frustrated, but he looks like he's about to switch gears here. That was unbelievable. That was great. Kurt Angle kicked out of the F5. It looks like the devil himself is about to come out of Brock Lesnar. If you see the look on Lesnar's face. Give it to him again. McMahon, this McMahon said, do it again, Brock. Do it again. And I agree with this McMahon. He needs to. Kurt Angle just got dropped on his head off the F5. Brock Lesnar back to his feet. The champion Angle's in trouble. Rocks on one leg, go cold for the F5 again. This time, Angle counters with Angle lock. Angle lock. Angle lock. It's locked in. It's locked in again. Kurt Angle is in dire straits cold. Lesnar makes it to the ropes. This time with the ankle lock locked in. The referee Mike Heel is right there. Lesnar to the ropes again and again. Angle towards the center of the ring. Lesnar's in trouble. Lesnar's in trouble. Brock Lesnar is in up 4 ranks. Brock Lesnar is in no man's land. Brock Lesnar has nowhere to go. McMahon's on the wrong foot. McMahon's freaking out. Lesnar's gonna tap. Is he gonna tap? Lesnar taps out. Here is your winner and still WWE Champion, Kurt Angle. I promised I wasn't gonna come out here tonight and play cheerleader, but good for you, Kurt Angle. Brock Lesnar deserved everything he got in that matchup here tonight. Kurt Angle.
So as you heard, Kurt Angle, with the even overcoming the odds as Vince McMahon obviously got involved to try and help Brock Lesnar, retains his WWE Championship, which he had won just 1 month prior at Vengeance 2003 when he defeated Big Show and Brock Lesnar in a triple threat match. But I played the audio from this clip of him retaining the championship because I always thought that his victory, retaining the title over Brock Lesnar at SummerSlam 2003 was such a big victory because, as you heard, he had Lesnar in the ankle lock. Lesnar taps out. The referee's turned around. Vince comes running in, hits him with the chair, opens the door for Brock to hit the F5, which Angle kicks out of. goes for a second F5, Angle counters, sticks in the ankle lock, and submits Brock Lesnar. And I always thought it was just a cool video, or a cool visual rather, because how many times do you see the behemoth and the beast known as Brock Lesnar submit? And the one thing about Kurt Angle to me is that he was always the perfect foe for Brock Lesnar. And there's this story that Angle told in when he did his interview with Stone Cold Steve Austin, that he actually beat Brock Lesnar in a real wrestling match backstage. And because Brock Lesnar was an amateur wrestler and Kurt Angle obviously had won an Olympic gold medal in amateur wrestling, it just seemed that their styles were a match made in heaven, and they clashed so well and they meshed so well in the ring. Everything about them, even the characters they portrayed, it was just a perfect storm when these two got involved. And whether it be Brock playing the heel or Kurt Angle playing the heel, which both of them are in my mind are best served as heels, it was just always such a great performance when these two locked horns. And for much of 2003, we got to see these guys headlining SmackDown all the time and the SmackDown pay-per-views. So Kurt Angle ends up losing his 5th WWE Championship a month later on edition of SmackDown to Brock Lesnar, and they continue their feud just up until, I would say, Survivor Series, when they had Team Angle versus Team Brock Lesnar, and that was the coming out party for John Cena, who had been in WWE for just about a year at this point, but was really starting to get pushed as a upper mid-card guy. He had a summer-long feud with The Undertaker in 2003. But by the time the winter of 2004 rolled around and the rumors started surfacing that Brock Lesnar was leaving, they turned Kurt Angle back heel to go toe-to-toe with Eddie Guerrero. And I already did a Rivalries episode about Kurt Angle and Eddie Guerrero in 2004, how much that meant to the career of Eddie Guerrero, what kind of chemistry those two had in the ring. And apparently they had some clashes backstage as well, based on what Kurt Angle talked about in his interview with Stone Cold Steve Austin. But Kurt Angle did not get another run as WWE champion after losing this title in 2003. And I always found that very peculiar, because he was such a workhorse for the company, and especially in a time when you didn't have The Rock anymore, you didn't have Stone Cold Steve Austin anymore, John Cena, Randy Orton, and Batista weren't quite main event stars yet. You just would have thought that Kurt Angle would have gotten leaned on more, much like we saw Triple H on Monday Night Raw, as he was basically the World Heavyweight Champion, save for a couple months here and there, for 3 years running from 2002 to 2005. 2004 goes all the way around. Kurt Angle does not regain the WWE Championship. In early 2005, he has a WWE Championship match at the Royal Rumble main event with him and Big Show and JBL. He loses that match as JBL retains the championship. And that was something that I always found a bit peculiar, is because in 2004, when Brock went away, they pushed JBL as the main event heel on SmackDown. And while JBL had a very, out of the blue run, and it came out of left field as him being shot up to the main event right away, and for all intents and purposes, it was a very successful run for JBL as WWE champion. I never quite understood why he got that run and Kurt Angle didn't. Maybe you could make the argument that you had been there, done that with Kurt Angle. He had a main event run as a heel champion from late 2002 to early 2003, leading up to WrestleMania 19. He had another short-lived run as a babyface in the summer of 2003 as well. But although JBL, at least in my mind, in terms of expectations, knocked his championship run out of the park, I always found it a bit peculiar that Kurt Angle didn't get at least a bit of that run, or at least another run with the WWE Championship. But leading into 2005, he embarks on a feud with Shawn Michaels. And this was one of the most, I don't know if you could say it was underrated, but I don't feel like it's talked about enough, because these two were kind of the counterparts to one another but on opposite brands as the workhorse carriers of their brands. As you can make the case that the workhorses of Raw were HBK and Triple H, and on SmackDown it was Taker and Angle. But why I draw the comparison between HBK and Kurt Angle is because of just how good they were in the ring and how they were ring generals and they could outperform whoever they were in the ring with. Like when Kurt Angle and Shawn Michaels were in the ring, it was very rare that they weren't the best in-ring competitor, no matter what match they were in. But when they had their 5-star classic match at WrestleMania 21, which was an interpromotional match between Raw and SmackDown, you could make the case that either one of them were the better performer. And the beginning of that match was very mat wrestling based. It was very technical. It was spent a lot on the ground. But as the match wore on, it got more and more intense. You had the springboard, I guess it was like a diving splash from Shawn Michaels to the outside of the ring when him and Kurt Angle went over the announce table. You had Kurt Angle running up the top rope and giving an Angle slam off the top rope. You had, in my mind, the best Sweet Chin music of all time when Kurt Angle is holding Shawn Michaels' face and screaming at him, and Shawn Michaels just pushes his hands away and Sweet Chin musics him with about 2 feet of play between him and Kurt Angle. And ultimately, Kurt Angle gets the victory. And I think it was a very big victory for Kurt Angle because, like I said, even though he had won 2 of his 5 WrestleMania matches leading up to this, none of his victories were very substantial. He beat Benoit at WrestleMania 17 and Kane at WrestleMania 18. But while his 2 main event WrestleMania matches and meaningful programs were with Guerrero and Brock Lesnar, and he lost both, you were waiting for Kurt Angle to get that big monumental victory at a WrestleMania because he had done everything else. 5-time WWE champion, main evented numerous big-time pay-per-views, one of the best rivalries in recent memories with Brock Lesnar, could hang with the best of them in the ring, but had never had that one mega main event win at a WrestleMania, and this is what his victory over Shawn Michaels gave him. And although it wasn't technically a main event, I think it by far stole the show and was better than the 2 quote-unquote main events of John Cena versus JBL and Batista versus Triple H. I think it was by far the best match on the card. But following WrestleMania 21, Kurt Angle was still stale. He started to become stale on SmackDown because he had pretty much done it all over there. And that led to him changing to Raw at the 2005 draft. And this was the first time we had seen Kurt Angle on Monday Night Raw in 3 years. Another reason that when done properly, the draft is so important and could be such a game changer for the WWE. He goes on to Raw and he engages in a very intense program with John Cena for the WWE Championship. And these two had never really crossed paths since Cena had become the WWE champion, and they both switched over to Raw at the same time in the 2005 draft. And this program is what really cemented Cena as a main event competitor, in my mind. He had won the WWE Championship from JBL, and then when he crossed over to Raw, he had a summer-long feud with Chris Jericho. But JBL, yeah, he was champion for 9 months, but you could make the case that he wasn't ever a true main event, bona fide top star in WWE. Chris Jericho was always kind of like a fringe, upper mid-card main event guy. But when, at post-SummerSlam 2005, when Kurt Angle locked horns with John Cena, is when you really cemented Cena as the WWE champion. But as Angle talked about in his documentary with Stone Cold Steve Austin, or not his documentary, his interview rather, he kind of didn't understand why Cena was getting pushed to the moon and he was being thrown to the wayside. And, Cena got the movie with the Marine, which Kurt Angle thought that he would maybe get, and, that would have allowed for him to get more time to rest. He obviously started having some real injury issues. He couldn't handle the workload anymore. And I think this is when you slowly but surely start seeing the career of Kurt Angle winding down, although we maybe did not know it just yet. But by late 2005, there was only 6 months left of runway in Kurt Angle's WWE career left, and we didn't know that. And you especially didn't know that given what happened on a January episode of SmackDown following the reveal that Batista got injured and had to relinquish the World Heavyweight Championship. So Teddy Long has a battle royal, a 20-man battle royal to determine a new World Heavyweight Champion. But remember, Kurt Angle is a member of Raw and had been for about 7 months at this point. But when the battle royal is about to get going, this happens.
Down here tonight. Well, we already crowned the new United States champ. Now we're going to find out who a new world champ is. We got one more entry. Who is it? What? What the hell is this? You got to kick me! General Manager Theodore Long! Does he know what's going on? Well, I know what's going on. Kurt Angle! That's Kurt Angle from Raw! Kurt Angle's here on SmackDown! Wait a minute, what the? Kurt Angle's a part of this battle royal to crown a World Heavyweight Champion! I don't know how he's swung this. Angle's part of Raw, and JBL is waiting for him. JBL just told the SmackDown locker room, move away, let me take on Kurt Angle. I want Raw's Kurt Angle. Here we go! Here we go! Kurt Angle and JBL, and that's a German suplex.
So as you hear, Kurt Angle returns to SmackDown and joins the Battle Royal to crown a new World Heavyweight Champion. And he goes toe-to-toe with JBL to start the Battle Royal. And again, a big deal because everyone adhered to the brand rules at this time. So to see a crossover between Raw and SmackDown was always a huge deal. But as the Battle Royal winds down to crown a new World Heavyweight Champion, it comes down to Kurt Angle and Mark Henry.
Got that choke on. Kurt Angle is not giving in here. It has been a relentless offense by Kurt Angle. The problem is Mark Henry's got not just a but he's got that wide base. He's going back to that head scissor again. Oh my God, be careful here. Kurt Angle under control. He's hanging on to the bottom rope. He's hanging on to the top rope. The 400-pounder on the top rope as well. Kurt Angle is close here. He's Mark Henry. I think it was Mark Henry that hit first. It is Kurt Angle! Kurt Angle is the World Heavyweight Champion! We saw it plain as day! Mark Henry's feet hit the ground first! Kurt Angle is the new World Heavyweight Champion! I cannot believe this night! He's on Raw! What the hell? How can he be here?
So as you heard, Kurt Angle, with the utilage of a head scissors, is able to flip Mark Henry over the top rope and win his first ever World Heavyweight Championship and his 6th world title in total, as WWE likes to group in the WWE title, World Heavyweight Championship, and now Universal Championship into one big pot and say you're a world champion if you've won one of these 3 titles. So in total, Kurt Angle has won 6 World Heavyweight Championships or 6 world titles, however you want to phrase it. And he goes on to be the face of SmackDown for the preceding 3 months as he defends the championship successfully against Mark Henry at Royal Rumble just a short few weeks after this. And he goes into WrestleMania as World Heavyweight Champion in a triple threat match between Randy Orton and Rey Mysterio, one that Rey Mysterio historically wins, and one of the most memorable World Heavyweight Championship victories in recent memory. And Kurt Angle, later on in 2006, ends up becoming the face of the ECW brand, the newly launched ECW brand. And that was very short-lived because about a month into that experiment, Kurt Angle leaves the company for TNA Impact Wrestling. And as he illustrated, he just couldn't take the schedule anymore of WWE. He couldn't do it anymore. He went on to have substance abuse problems that I won't really get into. But it really had an abrupt ending to one of the most storied careers and one of the faces of WWE at this time, because you still saw that he had so much left in the tank and that WWE still had a level of faith in him. As, you know, Batista goes down on SmackDown, they send Kurt Angle over there to be the face of the SmackDown brand in Batista's absence. They launched the new ECW brand. They send him there to be the face of it, but he couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't really carry that workload anymore. And the workload of Kurt Angle, or of WWE superstars in general, is well documented. And Kurt Angle is one of those guys that in the Ruthless Aggression era, he gave his body to WWE, and he was never on the shelf, even when he was injured, or I don't even know if he was or if it was just part of the storyline, but even when he was quote-unquote injured in early 2004, he was still on TV as the on-screen GM of SmackDown. He was always around. He never went away. He never missed a WrestleMania. I don't think he ever missed an extended amount of times, and following the abrupt departures of The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin in late 2002, early 2003, he was one of those guys that really helped bridge the gap for Vince McMahon and WWE until they had the next generation of stars in Cena, Orton, and Batista, and really helped WWE not miss a beat, as he was right in there with the likes of Shawn Michaels and Triple H and The Undertaker and The Big Show in really being workhorses for the company. And I would argue that when he was on his game, he was more of a main event guy than any of those guys, maybe save for Triple H. But Kurt Angle was a guy that, you know, he eventually returned in 2017 and was the GM of Raw for about a year and had his go-home run. And look, I got to say that when Kurt Angle came back, I really didn't like seeing him because you saw how broken down his body was. He wasn't even half the competitor he was back during this time. And, you know, I don't hold it against him. He did an admirable job given the circumstances of his body. But if you didn't see Kurt Angle in WWE in the early to mid 2000s, and all you got to see was his return to the company in 2017 and 2018, which culminated in just an absolutely forgettable retirement match against Baron Corbin at WrestleMania 35. It's a shame, and you missed out, and I'd really suggest you guys to go back and watch it. I did not ever watch Impact Wrestling, so I know that he had quite a few prime years with the company in the late 2000s and early 2010s, but I can't really talk about that because I never ever watched Impact Wrestling. But based solely on his return to WWE in 2017, you know, we didn't get to see the best years of Kurt Angle since early 2006 when he abruptly walked away from the company. And I really think they gave him not the best treatment when he came back to 2017-18. He kind of alluded to that when talking to Steve Austin. I thought his retirement tour or his retirement sequence of matches was really kind of disrespectful. I don't think that him being retired by Baron Corbin did much for anybody, especially given the fact where Baron Corbin is right now, which is just floating in irrelevancy among the WWE roster and on the WWE landscape as a whole. I still think it should have been John Cena, as many people do. But look, it's unfortunate the way his return to the company went, but we still have to remember what he did for the company in the Ruthless Aggression era and how important he was to carrying the company and making sure that it did not miss a beat in light of the departures of Rock and Austin and waiting for the next generation of stars to reach that mega potential. And that's why I truly believe that it was important to do this episode to outline the importance of Kurt Angle's career as a whole. And I never really appreciated him when he was wrestling. And even when he came back, I often groaned seeing him wrestle because I selfishly just wanted to see the old Kurt Angle, but for obvious reasons that wasn't there anymore. But after hearing that interview he did with Stone Cold Steve Austin, I just remembered the good times and the amazing moments that he gave the WWE fan base like myself. And I just can't thank Kurt Angle enough for what he gave to the business in the Ruthless Aggression era, making it what it was and what I still remember, and so many memorable moments, and not missing a beat, putting his body on the line each and every night, not taking breaks. And I fully respect that he had the bravery to walk away from WWE and do what was best for his health and getting himself healthy nowadays. And in light of that, I just want to say, thank you, Kurt Angle. And I'm really happy that you gave us those moments in the Ruthless Aggression era that you did. And as a whole, I think it is without a doubt that he should be considered one of the best in-ring competitors and characters of the Ruthless Aggression era, and probably in WWE history. So look, guys, that's about all I got for you today. I hope you guys didn't mind that I took a break from a Rivalries episode and paid kind of a tribute episode to the career of Kurt Angle, and I will talk to you next week.